for another scintillating Fringe, and it's got a whole series of them throughout this week. Just to make sure you're in the right place, this one is called Making It Work, Implementing a Business, Human Rights and Environment Act. So if you're not sure this is the right place for you, now's your time to discreetly run away. My name is Kevin Bonavia. I'm the newly elected Member of Parliament for Stevenage. I'm also the newly elected co-chair of the APPG, All Parliamentary Party Groups on Refugees, co-chairing of Alf Dubs. We've got a very experienced panel on either side of me today. We've got the new eternal Attorney General Richard Hermer on my left here. I've also got my newly elected colleague Alex Ballinger for Halesowen over here. Next to me here, I've got Olivia Williams, the co-director for the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. I've also got Daniel Leader, who's a lawyer and partner at Lead Solicitors, and I've got Chloe Cranston, who's the head of thematic advocacy programs Anti-Slavery International. So I realise time is quite tight of all these things, and I should just say that Richard here, given his role in government, may need to nip out at any time, so do watch out for that one. So without further ado, I'm going to pass on to Olivia, who's one of our co-sponsors, to open today's session. Olivia.
Hi, can you all hear me all right? Amazing. So firstly, thank you all for being here today. Today we have a new Labour government, which is fantastic, offering a new vision for renewal and proactive policy making that will reinstate Britain's integrity on the world stage. This means that this panel really could not have come at a more important time. This is because our leadership on the world stage really does start at home. It starts through British businesses and the UK public sector and how we conduct ourselves through our value chains, which more often than not branch into communities far beyond our borders. The fact is, UK companies and the public sector are connected to grave human rights abuses and environmental harms all around the world. And this leaves affected workers and communities out in the cold without access to justice or remedy. Examples include the fatal collapse of the Rana Plaza in Bangladesh, which housed garment factories for household brands like Matalan and Zara, but due to inadequate building upkeep, the collapse killed over 1,000 people. Some of these workers are still seeking justice today. Our existing legislation, including the Modern Slavery Act's Transparency in Supply Chains provision and Schedule 17 of the Environment Act, is toothless and it simply doesn't work. It has completely failed to address the situation of corporate impunity that British companies operate in. However, a British Business, Human Rights and Environment Act would not only hold businesses accountable, but also support them to do the right thing by people and planet. It would prepare them to operate more responsibly and easily in global markets and with our key trade partners. And where are we at with the campaign? Well, this campaign is really gaining momentum here in the UK and around the world. Today, I'm here with the Labour Campaign for Human Rights. We're an organisation that works to influence Labour policy on human rights issues, but we stand in partnership with Corporate Justice Coalition, who are also co-hosts of today's event, and a broad movement of charities, trade unions, academics and legal experts, and also 150 businesses and investors who support this law. This includes Microsoft, ASOS, Sainsbury's, for example. Also, 4 in 5 people in Britain support new laws to ensure businesses eradicate environmental harm and exploitative practices from their supply chains. There is also a private members' bill that is currently in Parliament, introduced by Baroness Hornsey, which we really urge the Labour Party to stand up today and support. The Labour Party has recognised that there is a need to assess the best way to prevent human rights abuses and environmental abuses in their supply chains within its National Policy Forum document. So today we really want the Labour Party to act on that and use this conversation to begin putting that assessment in motion.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. Very clear and succinct. I'm now going to pass on to Richard, who's just going to say a few words from his brief. Thank you.
I'm going to stand. Is that all right? It's just kind of old habits die hard. And I'm going to move the plastic water. Look, it's a huge pleasure to be here. This is my first event in my office. I like the idea of being the eternal, but that's not how democracy works, as I understand it. It's a huge pleasure to be here. 2 opening remarks before I just make some observations about the theme. So the opening remarks are, as I have said, and as colleagues in government have said, this is a new government that's coming in to do a rule of law reset. And part of that rule of law reset is proper engagement with all stakeholders on all issues. And on issues such as this, and on issues that concern me across the rule of law horizon and human rights horizon, real renewed engagement with the human rights community, with unions, with groups who are involved in these issues is of the utmost importance. And I have no doubt there will be times when we as a government will do things that the human rights community or sections of the NGO community will not like. But the difference will be is we will still want to listen. We will not be in the business of vilifying our human rights community and our NGO community. And I just wanted to say that at the outset. The other important caveat is that in my role as Attorney General, I am not a policy maker. And some of the themes that we are discussing are policy, which are for other of my colleagues. But what I want to do is just very briefly draw on my own experience on this particular issue. I mean, I've found in the 9 or so weeks we've been in government and in my role in the job, I've had to grapple with a range of legal issues, the things I've never considered before, and that's been part of the fascinating, exhilarating nature of the role. But fortunately, on this topic, it's something I do know a little about, having spent 20 years with Dan and Martin and others, effectively developing the law on corporate accountability and doing cases all around the world where people have been victims of corporate abuses and seeking to secure accountability. That's been my life, in large measure, my professional life since I came into this job. Now, I have seen the great utility of using courts to secure accountability, but I have also been, in those years, acutely aware of the limitations of litigation. And that is why efforts to develop a more systemic approach to human rights in the business world, it can only be something to be welcomed. And I just want to emphasise 2 aspects of that. Firstly, why I consider it is good for business, and secondly, why I consider it is good for victims of human rights violations. So it's good for business because what business want often is certainty, and what they do not want is the uncertainty of facing lawsuits in various jurisdictions. And so the more certainty, the higher the standards that prevent human rights abuses within companies, the better. And the more that there is as engagement on those issues, not just in this country but across jurisdictions, the greater the movement is to uniformity in how we deal with human rights. And I think many businesses get that. They get that, not least business to consumer get that, because fortunately we live in a world in which many more people, and as demographics change, more and more people rate human rights when they are making decisions about what they want to buy. But it also matters business to business, because many people want to work for companies that have ethical policies. And so I think a system that enshrines human rights in everything that companies does would be seen as business as good, and someone promoting our growth agenda, I see that as an enormous benefit. There are also real benefits for victims, because my experience has been when things go wrong. And what you want to do in the human rights world is stop things going wrong in the first place. And the other problem with the accountability through the courts is you can only ever deal with a fraction, a tiny fraction of accountability for people who have been impacted by corporate abuse of human rights. It's expensive, it's time-consuming, it can often be re-traumatizing. I mean, when you get the results, they are amazing, and Dan, no doubt, can talk about how they have been life-changing for thousands and thousands of people, but we are talking a tiny percentage in an imperfect system. So the more that we can work to ensure that these things do not arise with the frequency that sadly we have seen it, the better. So it is a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to be here with not only my parliamentary colleagues, but my colleagues in the NGO and human rights world. and I look forward to maybe not eternal conversations, but ongoing, really close engagement. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Richard, for setting out the systemic approach that we as a new government should be taking. I'm now going to pass on to a fellow lawyer. This time it is Daniel Leader, who's a lawyer and partner at Lee Day Solicitors.
Right, well, it's an enormous privilege to be here today, and thank you, Richard, for making time in your very busy schedule to come. Very meaningful for all of us. I've been working in the field of corporate accountability for about 20 years. 15 of those years have been at Lee Day. And we have the great Martin Day in the audience, who should be speaking on this panel as well, but we didn't know he was coming, so it's great to have him here as well. We specialise essentially in bringing cases against multinational companies, British multinational companies, who have done some terrible thing somewhere in the world where it's impossible to get remedy in the local jurisdiction. So we sue in London, and we get remedy in London on behalf of the victims. And as Richard says, over the years we've been able to change the law in the UK through successive cases, which have gone very well. I'll come on to that in a second. I just want to ask three very straightforward questions to this audience to begin. Firstly, just look at your mobile phone, or think about your mobile phone, and ask yourself the question, can you be confident that the supply chain of the minerals and factory workers and everything that went into making that electronic product is free of child labour, forced labour, or human rights abuses? Can you be sure of that? And while we're at it, can you be confident that the clothes you wear, the food you eat every day, products you buy from the high street, are also free of human rights abuses? Because I looked this up yesterday, the Global Slavery Index, you probably know much more about this than I do, estimates that the UK imported just this year £20 billion of goods that are likely to have been made with slave labour. And the uncomfortable truth is I can't be sure about the ethics of the products I buy, you can't be sure, because we just don't know enough about our supply chains. And the first question is, in 2024, is that acceptable? Second question, let's take it a step further. Is it, in your view, acceptable that British businesses, FTSE 100 companies and other large multinational companies in the UK, are entitled or allowed to effectively commit human rights and environmental abuse through their own subsidiaries around the world, in the global south in particular, without facing any real consequences? Is that an acceptable state of affairs? Third question, is it right that the current state of UK law, which Martin, Richard and I and others have fought hard to develop, currently incentivises British companies to turn a blind eye when faced with human rights allegations or concerns? If the answer is no to any of those three questions, then there needs to be significant legal reform. And specifically, there needs to be a Business, Human Rights and Environment Act. Because at the heart of this problem is corporate impunity in vast regions of the globe. Is it really happening in 24? I'm afraid the answer it is, on an industrial scale. Just to give one example in the short time I have, the Niger Delta in Nigeria, where oil has been extracted for the last 60 years, 30 million people live there. It has been environmentally devastated by Western oil companies. Those oil companies are now quitting the Niger Delta onshore operations, and they are essentially flogging their liabilities to local companies in the hope that no one notices they are leaving one of the biggest environmental crimes in history. Some of these are UK companies who've made billions of pounds of UK money, which has been repatriated to the UK and left the Nigerians in a state of utter devastation. That cannot be right in 2024. So, what is the current legal landscape? Well, here there is real cause for optimism, I would say. There are winds of change, and we've also got Richard Howard, who can talk about this very eloquently shortly. But essentially, the world is waking up to the gravity of the situation. In the last 4 years alone, There have been landmark judgments in Canada, France, the Netherlands, and our own Supreme Court. Here in 2 landmark judgments, which Richard was the QC for, KC now, unanimous judgments against Vedanta and Shell, the Supreme Court ruled that multinationals can be sued in UK courts for harms committed by their foreign subsidiaries, and the range of potential liability is much greater than anyone ever envisaged, and that has sent real shockwaves across boardrooms in the UK. In addition, in the EU, very recently, hot off the press, there has been the CSDDD, which is a human rights due diligence law which has now come into effect, and for the first time in history, that has placed all EU companies, all major EU companies, under an obligation to take steps to address human rights and environmental laws, including British companies who operate in the EU. But this is the rub. When it comes to law reform, the UK now in this area is firmly bottom of the class. And so, Richard, that's a challenge, maybe not to you, but to your colleagues. We really need to up our game. We led the way to the abolition of slavery 200 years ago, and now it's a chance with this new government to lead again. In my view, this is a total no-brainer. Richard has set out some of the reasons why. I'm going to give you 3 reasons which overlap with his. Firstly, UK business, consumers, investors, we need to have confidence that serious human rights and environmental abuses are not hidden in our supply chains. It cannot be right that consumers simply don't know what they are buying and whether they're in fact fueling human rights abuses in their consumption patterns. Secondly, business needs to be encouraged to do the right thing. Current law basically incentivizes a hear no evil, see no evil approach. The less you do, the less likely it is that you're going to be held legally liable. Again, that cannot be right. We need to level the playing field so everyone is under a duty to do the right thing. And thirdly, as Richard also says, where things do go wrong, where there are victims of serious human rights and environmental abuses, it cannot be this difficult for them to get the redress they deserve. We need to have more simple ways for victims to be able to seek redress of corporate human rights abuses. And this is not far left stuff. As Olivia says, businesses have been calling for this. I've got a letter, I think it's out of date, but there are 50 leading businesses that have called for this reform. These are big names. You've got Aviva and Asda and Nestle. I think you've now got 150 businesses. I'm totally out of date. And I think 40 investors with £15 trillion worth of assets who've been calling for this. You can update everyone on this, but this is not a far left agenda. This is also, there is a strong business case for this law. So, in conclusion, I just think future generations are going to look back with some shock that this state of affairs has been allowed to carry on for so long. Much as today, as we look back at UK companies who were involved in the slave trade 200 years ago with complete shock. This is a historic Labour government. It has the mandate for bold reform. And what could be more bold and more inspiring than ensuring that the new high-growth British economy we all hope for is built on a platform of fairness and justice and not on a platform of exploitation and human rights abuse. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. As I expected, you made a very compelling case for legal reform and its benefits for, well, both the victims, but also a good business case for it as well. I'm now going to pass on to Chloe Cranston from Anti-Slavery International to touch on some of the landscape out there, legal landscape out there, including what you mentioned, Daniel, the CSDDD. It's a bit more jargon for you there.
Great, thank you. You can all hear me fine. And thank you to SME4Labour, Corporate Justice Coalition and the Labour Campaign for Human Rights for having me. As said, I'm Chloe Cranston, the Head of Thematic Advocacy at Anti-Slavery International. For those of you who don't know us, I'm very happy to hear Lord Hermer's comments because we're considered the world's longest running human rights campaign, dating back over 180 years in the original UK abolitionist movement. So it's great to hear that the current government will hopefully want to engage with us. Some of my thunder's been a wee bit stolen, which gives me the opportunity to shorten my remarks a bit. It's very correct that the UK, on average, every year is estimated to import over $26 billion worth of products made with forced labour. That could be our electronics, our clothes, our solar panels, our food, and many other products. What that means is there's over 20 million people at any given time in forced labour around the world. The problem's getting worse. The numbers have increased due to climate change, conflict, and the COVID-19 pandemic. The number of people trapped in forced labour is over the population of Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland combined. In 2015, the UK was the leader in modern slavery in global supply chains globally. But now our model, the UK Modern Slavery Act, has been proven entirely unfit for purpose. And I'm happy to go into that in the Q&A. Notably, Anti-Slavery International was very heavily involved in the advocacy for it at the time. But even with that, we now say unfit for purpose completely. We need a new approach. In the meantime, as already covered, the UK has fallen entirely behind. The EU has adopted and the US is utilising much stronger approaches to address modern slavery in our supply chains. Critically for this discussion, as Dan has covered, in spring the EU adopted the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive with this horrible acronym, the CS-DDD or the CS3D. What this means is that in less than 3 years from today, companies with the largest turnover in the EU, including UK companies, will be required to conduct human rights and environmental due diligence in their value chains. We've worked heavily on this campaign as anti-slavery since 2017, and I'm happy to go into the details of the law in Q&A. But what is important to underline is the significance of the law. It's made history. It brings internationally recognised standards, the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which the UK government is committed to, into law. And given that the EU is the world's largest single market, it has the potential to influence business practices globally. And that means it has the potential to change the lives for millions of workers and communities all around the world, and also to make sure that our businesses protect our environment and the planet. At the same time, unless the UK introduces similar legislation, then UK businesses will be disadvantaged. At Anti-Slavery, we work a lot with many of the companies you see on this banner, which are supporting the need for a new law. They support it due to the need for harmonisation and a level playing field, including in light of the CS-DDD, the horrible acronym, but also to create a level playing field between those companies which are taking steps and then the many hundreds which are not, which is a really serious problem. Trade associations also support it. The Ethical Trading Initiative, the British Retail Consortium, and Tech UK have all called on the UK government to keep pace with the EU in light of the CS3D's entry into force. I also want to flag it will interlink and actually complement many of the current government's commitments and focus policies. For example, a green transition, the growth agenda, and the industrial strategy. Yet the UK doesn't only have an opportunity to meet the recent EU legislative standard, it has the opportunity to use an existing British legal model to ensure it's as effective as possible. This can be achieved with our proposed Business, Human Rights and Environment Act, which takes a so-called failure to prevent model of the UK BHREA Act. This model has been proven successful and effective and has therefore also been applied to other recent laws such as criminal facilitation of tax evasion, online safety and economic crime. The question is then, why not also human rights and environmental harm? A 2020 study from the British Institute for International Comparative Law found, for example, that such a law would provide legal clarity to UK business and also provide leverage for business with their third-party suppliers. There's two areas we really want to focus on that are crucial for driving better practice. One of which has been mentioned, which is the reversal of the burden of proof, moving the insurmountable barriers that many victims of harm face in bringing a claim. Reversing the burden of proof so that companies, those which have the most resource and information, are responsible for demonstrating that they took the most necessary steps to prevent the harm. It's also, and this has been covered by Lord Hermer, important to keep prevention of harm at the core of the due diligence responsibility. We essentially, and I'm sorry to say this, want to put Dan and Martin Day out of a job. We want the harm to be prevented. The Bribery Act has had this enormous impact on change in business practice, and we need to do the same with human rights and not have victims have to go to court. Simply put, companies in conducting UN Guiding Principle aligned and meaningful due diligence would be compliant under both UK Business Human Rights Environment Act and the EU CS3D. The difference only lies within the legal model and using a proven and effective British legal model. And while using that, we can also bring protection to the millions of workers at risk in the UK and around the world. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, John. Just say goodbye to, give my eternal thanks to the Attorney General there as he leaves. Thank you very much, Richard. And Chloe, thank you so much for that. Giving us, those of you who aren't aware of what's been happening in other jurisdictions and what we can do to catch up. So really appreciate that. My final speaker, but last but by no means least, is my also newly elected colleague, Alex Ballinger, for MP for Halesowen, is going to give his take and some of the things we hope we might be able to do as a new Labour government. Alex.
Hello, thank you very much, Kevin. I seem to have been promoted from the edge of the government here. So I'm Alex. I'm the new MP for Halesowen. I'm not a lawyer like some of my colleagues, but I did spend 8 years working in international development, including on employment programmes in the Middle East and in Pakistan. So I thought I'd share some reflections of some of the things that I've seen in person and some of the changes that we hopefully can achieve through legislation similar to what we're talking about today. So I initially worked on a refugee programme with Syrian refugees in Jordan to help them work in the garment sector. It was a joint European Union programme, so there are things we can learn from the EU sometimes. But this was really important because, as you know, there are many Syrian refugees that are working in the black market, lots of child labour in agriculture and across the board, and having international support that helps people move into regulated employment can improve incomes, but it can also prevent those real human rights abuses that we're seeing. And the other example I'll talk about is my time in Pakistan, where I worked with lots of UK businesses that were trading with Pakistan. In part, I was working with the brick kiln sector. So for those of you who are familiar with the brick kiln sector, lots of bonded labour, lots of child labour, entire families who are committed to their employer for their entire lives, basically. So a really difficult situation to work through. Not one that the UK businesses are necessarily involved in, but there are lots of spillovers for the suppliers that they work on. But I was really pleased to see companies like Marks and Spencer's and Olivia, which I think is one of the ones on the top here, to visit some of the sites that they were manufacturing garments in Pakistan and see the conditions that workers were in there, the dignity that they provided, the support and the finance, and the difference that was very obvious to see between good employers and bad employers. And we've heard from Dan and others lots of the environmental damages that we see across the board as well, which indicates how good regulations, good British corporate values can be very successful here. I also wanted to very briefly talk about the business case. So again, I'm not a lawyer. I don't work for business. I'm a politician. So I am thinking what people in my constituency think. And the people in my constituency, they think they don't want to buy goods that have human rights abuses in the supply chains. They don't want to be complicit in deforestation. They don't want to be complicit in any sort of environmental damage across the board. And it might not be their top issue, but if you ask them those questions, those are the things they're going to say. And I believe this sort of legislation is something that will be incredibly popular cross-party in the UK. I think many of us talked about levelling the playing field amongst businesses. I think that would be extremely helpful, and this sort of legislation gives that benefit. And then again, thinking with my international development hat on, public finances are extremely tight. We probably would like to be putting more attention into environmental programmes, human rights programmes overseas, but we don't have the UK government funding right at the moment to do that. But with legislation, we can put that burden on UK businesses, and we can achieve many of the same aims that we were hoping to do with some of that spending. Anyway, I'll end it there. It's really important, and thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Alex, giving your own personal experience, but also reminding people that, as elected representatives and as a government, we were mindful of also our constituents who are consumers in all this as well. So the other aspect in the equation. We've come now to the session where we have to take comments or questions from the floor. I'm just wondering if we've got do we have a roving mic? We do, great. So if you raise your hand, I'd be grateful if you're happy to give your name as well before you make your point. So I saw the lady in the second row there, your hand first.
Thanks very much. My name is Kerry Box. I am a campaigner at Friends of the Earth in Northern Ireland. We're somewhere up on the list of supporters of the Business, Human Rights and Environment Act. And I also work on trying to encourage the UK government to institute a new legal right to a healthy environment within the UK. So I think my question here is we've heard a lot, very rightly, about the impact on people here, but only towards the end did we get on to the environment. So I'm interested in one, how the panel feels that the Business, Human Rights and Environment Act could improve the lives for the most impacted communities in the UK and the environmental impacts they're feeling from business. And secondly, to find out what you think Labour can or should be doing in the wider environmental justice space to ensure that people have a legal right to a healthy environment, like the UN says we should here and abroad.
Right. Thank you. What I'm going to do is take comments and questions in the round, and I'm going to go through our speakers one by one, and they can touch on what they think, what they can answer, if that's okay. Next one is going to be Richard.
Richard Howard, and I was a member of the European Parliament who put human rights due diligence in the first European Sustainability Reporting Rules, and I've worked on and advocated in this area ever since, including on the CSDD. My question to the panel, but really to all of us, we're at a Labour Party conference, and we know who our new government is absolutely fantastic, right? But they've got a lot on. So what are the arguments we use within the party to make this a priority issue? I'll give you three very briefly, Kevin. Number one, the international partners that we're re-engaging with and want to, Germany through its Supply Chain Act, France through its devoir divisionals, Biden through the forced labour due diligence rules, they've all been doing this. And I think if they've been doing it, and then we just are silent on the issue, I don't think that's where our government really wants to be. The second point made by Dan, but I'll just develop it, is about CSDD. It will apply to British companies, and not just those that have subsidiaries or plants in the European single market, because it covers the supply chain of big European companies. Some people say that's going to end up 51% of all companies in the world. We'll see. But it's always been an argument in the Labour Party that, we've left the European Union, but let's actually do the rules for ourselves, not have it done through the back door in the EU. We're open to that criticism, and I think there's an argument we can use that. And the final thing is this: when you see the list of companies that are up there, it's not just a list. Those are people who have, for over 10 years now, since we got the guiding principles, have worked out how you do supply chain due diligence. It's not impossible. And they are people who are not just don't want rules because they don't want to go to court. They don't want human rights abuses. That's why they're doing it. And I do think that Labour can sometimes be trapped in old thinking that it's just regulation. And so we have to get people within the party to wake up to the fact that there are big people in business investors who want this because actually it's their aim. So those are the arguments I suggest people use.
Some powerful arguments. Thank you, Richard. Yes, you.
Hi there. My name's Alice Sayek. I'm a Senior Policy and Research Officer at a charity called the Work Rights Centre. So we do casework and advice for migrant workers in the UK who've experienced labour exploitation. And I guess my kind of challenge or question for the panel really is how we argue against some of the counter-arguments to this. So in sectors like horticulture and in social care, where you've got extreme financial pressures, particularly at the bottom of the value chain. You've got farmers, up in arms about audit requirements. Social care is really fragmented in England. It's really hard to regulate that sector generally. What are the sorts of things we can say to Labour, to those businesses, to actually get them on side? And I guess, my question is kind of steered towards that SME perspective.
Okay. Yeah. Arguments of persuasion. Okay. Yes, there's a lady just towards the back there.
Thanks very much for a great panel discussion. I'm Lisa Wise, I'm the Director of Global Policy Advocacy and Research at Save the Children. I was wondering if you just unpack a little bit more as to why you think the UK is a laggard on this agenda and how much really we expect that to change with the new administration that's come in, or are there blockers that are still there that we really need to be kind of tackling, and what's your assessment on that? And then, coming from a child rights organisation, I have my own answer to this, but I wondered what you think the particular value of an international human rights framework is in this arena versus other approaches to ESG, and whether you feel like the backlash that we've seen against ESG in the US and elsewhere is a threat to this agenda in the UK specifically as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, time for one more, otherwise I'm going to take responses from the panel. Can't see any hand. One more. Yep, lady at the very back.
Hi, thanks for a great panel. I'm a DT from Protection Approaches. We work on the prevention of identity-based violence and mass atrocities. And my question is really about how this act and also the campaign around these global value supply chains can give leverage to different strategies within HMG. So, for example, there is an atrocity prevention hub in the FCDO, which is looking at how to coordinate efforts across different thematic teams and government departments to utilise all of the different policy levers, including regulation of companies, illicit finance, etc., all of these supply chains, in making sure that the UK isn't driving atrocities or being complicit in them, or has different points of leverage that they can work with different allies internationally to basically get a bit more agency in this world that is very volatile.
Great. Thank you very much. Okay, now I'm going to take some responses. I think I'll stick to the order that we began with and do it that way, if that's all right. Olivia, would you mind starting?
Sure. On green,
take your pick on what you think you can answer, and hopefully we'll cover all the points where we can, if we've got the expertise to do so.
I think I'll take the question on SMEs and the arguments we can have to convince them. I mean, we are sat in SME4Labour's hub, so hopefully this is one way to get the word out there. I think really importantly there is this idea that businesses and human rights sit at a juxtaposition and they never agree with each other. They do. There are people behind businesses. They don't want to be committing human rights abuses or kind of indirectly attributing to them, firstly. Secondly, I think we need to look at the role of the regulator here. Like, there will be an independent regulator that will need to be set up, and this can have a supportive role for businesses. It can help them to kind of training, capability training, coming up with action plans, these forward-looking plans, which can help support SMEs in their journey to kind of looking through their transparency in their supply chains. And then I had one more point. Regulator. And then the only other thing is SMEs, right? They will have their own, their suppliers will often be bigger businesses themselves, and they can really carry some of the burden of this. I think there was a study done by the OECD a few years ago, and it said there wasn't going to be an undue burden on SMEs simply because of the way their value chain operates.
Thank you very much. Daniel.
Lots of great questions. Can you hear me? In terms of the Friends of the Earth question, lots of really good, important points there. In terms of the wider environmental justice agenda, I do think the work you're doing on the right to a clean, healthy environment is crucial. Cases I'm doing against Shell, we're actually arguing that the Nigerian constitution applies directly to them, and therefore the right to a clean and healthy environment via the African Charter directly applies to Shell. and that issue is coming up next year in the High Court. Dave Sheller furious about this and dispute it vigorously. But that's what's curious about this, is actually many of the countries where these harms arise have very progressive laws in place which are totally unimplemented. And what we're finding is we're actually implementing more progressive laws from these countries in the UK courts by suing the parent companies, because it's the foreign law that applies. So I think absolutely we need to push on that for the UK government as well. There's also this whole new debate about ecocide, and I think that's crucial, because I've now been working with Martin on the Niger Delta for over a decade, and what is happening in the Niger Delta is ecocide. It's a textbook example, and these are our companies who have made billions, who are just walking away, leaving the biggest crime scene in history behind them. So those two things would make an enormous difference, I think. Just very quickly, without monopolising, in terms of how, why is the UK a laggard? I think it's a laggard because we've had 14 years of Tory chaos, where other countries have been able to make real progress on this area. Now we have stability and a huge majority. It is time to make the case for this government to really push on with this agenda, and all the points Richard makes are absolutely spot on. So it is my hope and prayer that this will now take off within the government.
Thank you. Full of optimism, that's what we want in this room. We've got just 3 or 4 minutes left, but so I'm just going to pass on to our final two speakers. Chloe.
Thanks. I can probably elaborate a bit more on the SME point as well. So as said, I worked really, or my organisation, but yeah, also me, worked really heavily on the EU agenda, as did Richard in the audience, and that the SME discussion was so heavily addressed within that, and I think that should be looked at in terms of how did the EU deal with that. But I think important to understand that some of the largest SME associations in the EU did support the CS3D, and critically what introducing this law is about making sure that the largest companies don't simply push down the burden of responsibility onto their suppliers, which is what we do see happening in the absence of any laws. It's also about making sure companies don't just push audits onto their suppliers, which is one of the biggest approaches to address forced labour right now, and it's a complete and utter farce. And what this would be about is actually shared responsibility and working with suppliers and engaging them, improving their capacity. Human rights and environmental due diligence is also about reform of purchasing practices. Purchasing practices, particularly if we're talking about supermarkets or fashion, are one of the biggest drivers of exploitation. And a company that is actually doing human rights and environmental due diligence would also be amending its business model and strategies. And that is part of the CS3D. So these are many of the things we can be talking about. On what I'm going to call the Save the Children question, I wanted just to clarify, is your why question, why haven't they done it, or what is happening globally? Well, we've worked on this since, as I said, we worked on the Modern Slavery Act, and then we've been calling for a new approach since 2019, actually. So we're now 5 years in. The previous government just stuck their head in the sand. We're sticking with the Modern Slavery Act, claiming it was sufficient, committing to allegedly reforming it. They didn't even do that. But even if they had reformed it, it still wouldn't have actually changed anything, because that is not about changing commercial practices and what businesses do. So we really are hoping that this new government does actually commit to new approaches. But I suppose it's a question to the former government why they stuck their head in the sand. And I think it's important to say they weren't just ignoring the annoying NGOs like us. They were annoying businesses. We've worked with these businesses for years. The former ASOS CEO wrote an op-ed in the Times, I think in 2020, calling for the failure to prevent model for this law. So they were ignoring us and they were ignoring businesses. The atrocity crime question at the very end was of interest to me because we work on Uyghur forced labour, which should be considered likely a crime against humanity, and I'm happy to pick that up maybe afterwards, offline, so to speak, given the time.
Yeah, and that's thank you, Lauren. It's a very good point. There's so much we can talk about, so please do stick around and speak to some of our speakers after we finished. Last but by no means least again, Alex.
Always at the end. So in answer to the question from our colleague from Protection Approaches, I worked for the Foreign Office for a number of years, and we really sometimes struggle to influence people on their human rights approaches when we approach them diplomatically. And there are lots of cases where Lots of private conversations happen behind the scenes, but not very much changes. But people often listen when there are finances involved. So these sort of regulations, if they change the behaviour of business, they may be much more effective than just straightforward diplomatic approaches. So I think it is important. And secondly, I think there was a question maybe from Richard about how do we make the argument inside the party. I think we've all talked about some really good arguments for why this legislation or legislation like this needs to be taken forward. I think the great news is there are lots of MPs like myself and Kevin, lots of people that have worked on human rights, that have worked in international development, that are going to be pushing for these changes from inside the system. So I think come and speak to us, come and do events in Parliament, we'll try and speak to the ministers, and we'll try and get the change that we absolutely need.
Thank you very much, Alex. I'd like to echo that. You do have two advocates in the Commons, at least here, and there are plenty more out there, I can assure you. I want to thank all our speakers for giving your time today, and everybody for listening and your contributions. As I think we've heard today, there is a wide coalition support for legal reform. This country has fallen way behind our neighbours in recent years. What's been missing is a government willing to take this on and and have the political will to deliver that change, which so many people are crying out for, whether it's the victims, the businesses out there, and people, the consumers that we represent as MPs as well. So let's, each of us in our own different ways, I hope, keep putting the case. We will ourselves on this table. And again, thank you for your time today, and let's keep the conversations going.
I want to put myself out the job as well.
Thank you.